Hi, in this video, we are going to talk about the newly announced AWS DevOps Agent. This was announced, I think, early in December, maybe a week or two before the reInvent conference was held. So this is, to me, one of the more compelling announcements made. Keep in mind that the DevOps Agent is in preview right now. The good news is when it's in preview, it's free. You're not going to be charged for the agent. And to be clear, if the agent searches for logs, then it's going to incur the same cost as if you yourself were accessing logs, retrieving data. But running the agent itself right now is free. The downside of it being a preview, you can expect changes to be made. Maybe not quite ready for prime time, but I thought this would be a great time to show a video, give it a test case, let it access an application that I have intentionally broken and see if it can identify the root cause and if it can give me some remediation instructions, how to get the application healthy again. And then maybe more importantly, does it give me any advice on how this can be eliminated, this problem can be eliminated in the future? It's going to be a very simple test application, but I figured instead of spending time designing a very complex app, let's do a simple app and let's see what this agent's all about. So we all know what happens. Well, maybe we all don't know, but those of us that have been lucky enough to be on call, and I've been on call at different parts of my career, either as a CTO, director of infrastructure, CIO. I've always liked to be on the calls along with the staff, but regardless, the problems tend to occur nights, weekends, holidays, birthdays, anniversaries. Critical issues never happen during business hours. That would just be too convenient. But we all know the drill. You get paged, you're groggy, you try to log on, you try to access all of the monitoring tools. You may find out someone changed their password, someone forgot to pay the bill. But nonetheless, you're jumping from data source to data source, maybe the AWS console, going into CloudWatch, going into CloudTrail. And so the whole premise of the DevOps agent really is to do all that event correlation automatic for you. And I'm sure it'll get better over time, but let's see what it's all about. So in the demo, I have a very simple application. We'll talk about that architecture in a minute. I'm going to intentionally break it. I'm going to add some latency. And I've preset a CloudWatch alarm. If the latency is greater than 1,000 milliseconds, raise an alarm and go into the alarm status. And that is what I'm going to ask the DevOps agent to focus on. Hey, I just had a CloudWatch alarm, go troubleshoot. So we'll let the DevOps agent investigate it. We'll find out what its findings were. Did it jump to correct assumptions and findings, or did it miss the mark? And then I'll give you my thoughts on how the DevOps agent sits today and if I think it's worth actually experimenting or if maybe you're better off waiting for it to get a little bit better. So AWS and Microsoft really introduced very recently the concept of frontier AI agents. And this is to differentiate these agents from a typical chat interface with an LLM where you give it a prompt, it responds with code, with text, with an image. And these frontier AI agents are very highly capable and they can run for extended periods of time without any human intervention. So it's not prompt response, prompt response. If, as we dig into this DevOps agent, you give it a task and it's going to have its own thought processes. It can create some sub agents to run some tasks in parallel, but it's going to be a very robust approach to DevOps. And ideally, it should be like a junior engineer who's very capable and works very quickly. And we'll see if it's that talented junior engineer or is it more like an intern that just showed up on day one without any cloud experience. But we'll see. Massively scalable, can handle large environments. And these frontier agents, at least now, Microsoft and AWS are focusing on frontier agents for software development, security, and DevOps. We're talking about the DevOps agent in this video, and next I'll be covering the new security agent. So how does the DevOps agent work? So first, there's a trigger, and in my case, as I said, it's going to be a CloudWatch alarm because of some latency. At that point, we trigger the investigation, the agent goes to work, and you'll see in the console, actually on a web application, think of it as an AWS console. I'll show you the UI, but it's seen using a browser, but outside of the console. It'll make more sense. It looks for correlation, it looks for patterns, it'll take a look at logs, it'll look at any code deployments, it'll take a look at other logs, flow logs, API gateway logs, whatever logs are available to it. It'll take a look to try to determine the root cause of the incident. It'll propose a probable root cause. And then there's a prevention step where it'll suggest how to remediate things like this from happening in the future. And the key word I call out here is autonomous. You're not directing it one step at a time. And keep in mind that there's nothing stopping you today from using ChatGPT or Claude from Anthropic, using the AWS API MCP server and saying, hey, there's something broken in my account, and having that LLM via the AWS MCP server try to troubleshoot. But again, you're going to direct it one step at a time. This frontier agent is much more capable. It is really targeted at root cause. So what kind of information, metrics, sources of data, and metrics does it have access to? Certainly CloudWatch metrics, CloudWatch logs. You want to make sure that you've got some way to indicate something's failing. If not CloudWatch, we'll talk about how Datadog, New Relic, Splunk, other third-party services could be used to trigger an agent investigation. X-ray traces, deployment history, resource configuration. Obviously, when something breaks, more times than not, it's because something's changed within the environment. It's going to look at the alarm history of the tool you're using to monitor the health of your environment and application. If you wish, you can give it access to your code repo, and you can tie it to third-party apps. And if the app isn't natively supported with integration into AWS, you can use an MCP server. And I'll show you the configurations for that one. So my application is very simple, and interestingly enough, I had Claude from Anthropic actually write this application because I didn't feel like cranking out some Python code, and Claude is much faster. But I've got some bash scripts to use for not only deploying the SAM application, the serverless application, but a traffic generator. And so this bash script is just going to make curl commands execute every couple of seconds. It's going to call the API gateway. That API gateway is going to invoke the order function, which is written in Python. That Lambda script will be talking to a DynamoDB database. And the agent will have access to CloudWatch metrics and logs, the latency alarm that I set for 1,000 milliseconds. And so very simple workload. You won't see workloads this simple in many customer environments, but I thought it was good enough to give you a demo of what the DevOps agent can do, even if it's a simple. So again, the data is flowing from my bash script. up to the API gateway. API gateway endpoint invokes the Lambda function. The Lambda function talks to DynamoDB. So as you might expect, the DevOps agent is really going to look at those three services and try to determine where is the latency. Is it load on the gateway? Is it load on DynamoDB? Is it somewhere in the application logic? And so I'm going to now start the traffic generator. Actually, I already started it, but let's go ahead and I'm going to go over to my terminal. And here in the right window, you can see that everything's in green. So all the latency is under 200, under 300 milliseconds. My alarm is set for 1,000. Let's actually go into CloudWatch. Let's just make sure that we have healthy. Okay, so the API gateway is in the OK status, which is what I'm going to do now is I am going to deploy a change to that Python script inside Lambda, and I'm going to introduce some latency. So I'm going to call a script called breakout. And once this runs, it actually has a 3-second delay. And on the right-hand side, my traffic generator, you'll see that it senses a sense in the latency. So it has now deployed the broken code. And if you look at the invocation of the API gateway endpoint, now the latency is all of a sudden 4,000, 3,000. So I'm going to go back over here to CloudWatch, and we're going to watch the alarm trigger. As soon as it has enough data points, going to put that into alarm step. All right, so now we can see that the API gateway alarm has triggered. And so up at the top here, I've got a shortcut for the AWS DevOps Agent. Now, when you invoke this for the first time, I've already invoked it in preparation for this video. The first time you do it, it's going to ask you to create an agent space. That really is just a namespace, so you can have some configuration details set for that space. If you have multiple development teams, you might expect that each development team has a different agent space. Maybe you do different spaces for different workloads who rely on different tools. Nonetheless, let me look at the namespace that I have here called test agent, and let's walk through some of the configuration. So one of the first things it does is it tries to determine what are the resources inside of AWS that it may have to research in performing root cause analysis. As you can see here, it found really 31 different resource types. It found CloudWatch alarms. It found the Lambda function. It found security groups, IAM roles, etc. So under topology, there's not much you can do to control this. This is simply just going out there and grabbing information. Now, one of the callouts here was it doesn't have access to my code, and I intentionally did not use the Amazon pipeline or put my code into GitHub. I wanted to see how well it could troubleshoot something if it didn't have access to the code repo. But clearly, once you're using this in a more production capacity, giving it access to your code repo will help it improve its ability to troubleshoot application. You look at the capabilities section of the DevOps agent, it always has to run, at least while it's in preview, in US East 1, Northern Virginia. And so you'd ask for the primary account that you just set up DevOps agent. If you have multiple accounts, in most production environments, if you follow AWS organizations and control tower best practices, you'll need multiple accounts, maybe a shared database, a different account, as the application code. But if you have additional AWS accounts, you can add here so it can look at all of the accounts. In terms of telemetry, here's where if you're using Datadog, Dynatrace, New Relic, or Splunk, you can do that. If I go into pipeline are your code repos. So here, GitHub or GitLab supported out of the box. ServiceNow or Slack, if you need the DevOps agent to communicate to you when it's working and it has results ready, you can do that either through ServiceNow, have it create a ticket, or give you updates in Slack. And then MCP server, if you need to have the DevOps agent interact with some third-party tool and it doesn't have native integration built in from AWS, here you could just register the MCP server. I haven't played with that yet, but that looks pretty interesting. So that really is it here for this and a webhook section. So that is all the capabilities. Again, that's all in a namespace. So the capabilities for one workload potentially could be different for business reasons for another. Otherwise, you could just use the same space. And I spoke about that there's a web application. And I haven't heard AWS mention this, but I'm sure as they were designing this, they had to decide, should the agent communicate with the user through the AWS console and using the UI that's provided from the native AWS console, or did they want to do a different web application? So in this case, they are using a web application. So I'm going to click on operator access. Since I'm already signed into AWS, it's going to authenticate me with those credentials. And you can see I've run this a couple times. One of the things I want to do is make sure I understood the tool enough to speak about it, but I also wanted to see, since Gen AI is non-deterministic, meaning it can come up with different answers at different times, I wanted to see how consistent this is. And you would hope that facts are facts, the items in the log, etc., and that the root cause should be pretty similar across multiple. And so far, 3 out of 3 all had the same root cause. You can either describe an investigation you want it to run, or it can be triggered by an alarm, high CPU usage, or maybe error rates. Maybe 404s are spiking. Well, I'm just going to say latest alarm because I know that CloudWatch is in an alarm state. It gives me a default prompt. I'm not going to give it any more information. I'm just going to go with the default that say, hey, there's a CloudWatch alarm. Please go fix it. And this is where I think they really needed a robust interface that has a chat window on the right, with, some support for graphics, a scrolling window. I think they just decided this was a robust interface and allows it to grow over time. So I heard AWS, if you listen to the session talking about the DevOps agent, they wrestled with how much information do they show the user during the investigation. And what I remember them saying was they decided to err on the side of caution and say too much is better than not enough. And all in all, this takes about 6 or 7 minutes. So I'm not going to wait the 6 or 7 minutes. I'll scroll down as soon as it gets past the planning phase. But right now, it's planning on what is the attack, not the attack, but what is the approach going to be? Does it need to create some sub-agents? Is it going to do things in parallel? So you can see all the things doing here. Check for recent deployments, analyze Lambda, look at the API gateway traffic patterns. Is the issue caused potentially by high traffic? Maybe it's bots. searching Lambda logs, checking the DynamoDB table. So really all the things that a skilled support engineer or SRE engineer might be doing. But since that takes a while, let me go back to different investigation that I ran. This one. So once the timeline finishes, you'll have access to the full timeline. It's kind of an interesting read just to see how it approached the troubleshooting process. Even though it's a pretty simple application, it had a number of things that it had to go through. And so it creates the timeline and it identifies root cause here. A Lambda function code deployment. You saw me deploy a change to the code. I mentioned I had a 3-second delay. Even though it doesn't have access to my code, it said, boy, it looks like it might, I'll highlight it here, suggesting the code contains intentional delay logic, such as a time.sleep for 3 seconds, which is exactly what I did. So pretty impressive that it knows that because it's exactly 3 seconds each time, that doesn't look like normal load latency. And because it's consistently the 3 seconds, 3 seconds. So it assumed that that was in the code and it guessed right. But if I go up here to the top, you've got the timeline. I can go into root cause. And I've got this kind of summarized in my deck, but as you can tell here, it has the root cause. This is the same block of text that was at the bottom of the timeline. And then I've got the mitigation plan in my deck that I'm going to return to. But once you have looked at the root cause, if you agree that the root cause is accurate, in this case it was, you can click on generate mitigation. And this is going to take a while. I've already done this previously, so I'll show you what that is when I get back over to the slide deck. But all in all, I think it did a pretty good job considering that this is still in preview. And yes, it's a very simple use case, but still pretty interesting. So I went ahead, I broke it. We engaged the DevOps agent and the root cause. So I highlighted some of these things in orange. So it knew by using CloudTrail that the Jeff admin, that's my IAM user, deployed Lambda function code. Doesn't have access to the code, but it's seeing different code signatures, which means that the sizes were different, or at least the code changed because the signature changed. So it's saying, hey, there was a deployment happen and it looks like it was different code. So it's saying, hey, there were some actual code changes. It's noticing that when the Lambda code was deployed, it had an exact blocking behavior and it guessed that, hey, you've got a time.sleep call that's embedded in your. So pretty impressed that it found. I asked in the chat window after it finished the root cause, I asked for what kind of data was it looking at. And as you might have seen on the timeline, it checked out Lambda to see if it could rule out or identify Lambda as a cause, looked at all the metrics and latency and patterns associated with the API gateway. It looked at the performance of the DynamoDB table to rule that out as not causing the latency. CloudTrail, who did what, who changed what inside of the AWS environment. Certainly looked at the CloudWatch alarms and logs, looked at CloudFormation, and looked at role and permission changes just in case that this was caused with some kind of. So you might see the different services being accessed will depend on your environment and the services you are running, but looks pretty comprehensive. Remediation, I think I was really more impressed with this, the remediation, and then the how do you eliminate this in the future. But this says rollback Lambda. This is pretty obvious. AWS admitted that at some point they would like the DevOps agent to be given the ability to roll back changes or to go ahead and, let's say, upgrade EC2 instance to a larger instance size if it's hitting some bandwidth in terms of compute or memory. But here it identified, hey, you still have to do the rollback, but it said, hey, that last push caused the problem. You want to roll that back prior version. And then the prevention, this is what I thought was really interesting when it noticed that, hey, when you deployed your code, you deployed that to all potential users that are accessing the API gateway and invoking that script. And so what it's recommending, and I highlighted this in orange, is why don't you go ahead and do a different deploy and shift only 10% of the traffic to the new code. And it's saying have a 10-minute canary window. Every minute, 10% more user traffic goes over. So if you have a problem during the initial rollout, at most it'll impact 10% of your customers, not 100%. And it gives you some detailed steps. I just copied the next steps, but I'm going to be doing different use cases on my own, just taking a look at, boy, is the prevention as accurate as it has here. But whether you do a blue-green deployment or whether you do this traffic shift over a short period of time, definitely good information if you were troubleshooting this happening. So, did the AWS DevOps agent get this right? Well, I actually did add a time.sleep for 3 seconds in the Lambda handler function. And although that's a simple thing to test, it actually did find that. It did guess that there was a 3-second delay that was hard coded, and it nailed it. It did look at the API gateway, looked at the database, looked for other causes. In this case, it was. So what impressed me, speed of correlation. I do think 6 to 7 minutes was a little long, but again, this is in preview. You're not being charged for usage of the agents. So once they start billing for it, are you going to get more compute power behind the agent? Possibly. But if you had, let's say, a support engineer, probably would have taken them, if they're not real familiar with an application, 10 to 15 minutes minimum to go from dashboard to identify the deployment context, the way that it identified everything. It looked like it did a pretty thorough review of all the metrics and all the logs and all the correlation data that it could grab. It identified code as the cause without repo access. I think I mentioned this earlier, but you certainly want to give it access to your code once you trust this, because it'll be that much easier for it to pinpoint where in the code logic was a problem identified. And that'll be some interesting tests to run if you have a lot of homegrown applications written for US. And then the evidence quality. I like the way it spit it out. It'd be nice to maybe have a condensed version, but just showing how it went through all the different aspects of gathering data, making assumptions, ruling something out, or using something as a root cause. Overall, being in preview, I think this has a lot. So when to use it? Well, I would say it's worth using now in a dev or sandbox environment. It doesn't look like it could hurt anything running in a production account. But I just think anytime there's a new service, always good to use it in a limited environment. Maybe it's dev, maybe it's test, maybe it's a sandbox. So latency spikes, increases in error rates, if resource utilization is suddenly out of whack, if you don't know what's causing a problem, I think it's worth invoking a DevOps agent, especially while it's free, just to learn what it can and cannot do. Anything that's time sensitive. We have a managed services team for AWS, and I think we're probably talk about running this in parallel with our support engineers and really kick the tires on this and see when it's good and when it's not. What is not a replacement for anything, I'm guessing, anything very complex it might have trouble with, at least until you can ingest things like runbooks, workload documentation. It might need some additional guidance in the future for really complex architectures. Don't use it for security incidents because there is a security agent. I'll be talking about that in a future video. Capacity planning, forecasting, cascading failures, anything that requires business context to understand root cause, probably not a great fit for yet. But since it's a preview, who knows what is. So to me, the big picture is not that the DevOps agent is going to take your job, but hey, hopefully AI can make your job much more, at least the job of the support staff that has to troubleshoot problems and resolve them. So the pages aren't going to disappear yet. This agent isn't running on its own, fixing every problem as fast as it occurs. You're going to have to start it. You're going to have to decide if you believe that has identified the right root cause or not. Hopefully it does increase the efficiency of finding the root cause and decrease the resolution time. I put here probably 30 minutes to maybe 5, 6, 7 minutes. And your time is redirected. Hopefully you get off that support call faster and you can redirect your time to sleeping if the call is midnight or weekend, or having fun with. So to get access is pretty simple. It's an open preview, so you don't have to request access. It is limited to US East 1, which is North Virginia, right now during the preview stage. So you'll have to go to US East 1. It's just go to the DevOps agent, just query that in the AWS search bar, just enable that for your account. As I said, you're going to create that DevOps AI agent space, which is the namespace. Then you can add in any third-party connections, etc. You do want to make sure if you have it troubleshoot something, you want to have, whether it's X-Ray, CloudWatch, Datadog, New Relic, Splunk, the more data, the more metrics, the more logs it has to identify the root cause, the better. And as I said, start with non-production. It just feels safer. This is read-only. It can't make changes to me. I sleep better at night. I preview in a production. So my recommendation, definitely try it. Don't expect miracles maybe on day one while it's in preview, but if you can test something, if you can leave it running, if you have CloudWatch alarms that typically trigger, let it have a chance at coming up with a root cause so you can get to understand its strengths and weaknesses. I think if you do it, you'll certainly learn a lot more than just by watching this video, although hopefully some of this was valuable to you. There's a shortage of videos out there because it's in preview. AWS, it's more of a marketing presentation that they did at reInvent. I've been doing some YouTube searches. I'm sure there'll be some good videos coming out, but being hands-on might be your best way to learn until the other use cases, the other reviews start coming out and getting published. So the question really isn't, is AI coming into operations? Clearly it is, whether it's AWS, other cloud providers. The question really is how quickly can you learn to work with it? Even if you don't work with AWS today, you're studying AWS, learning all about it. I think learning how these new agents, the DevOps agent, the security agent work, definitely a good conversation point to make during the interview, just to show that you're keeping up with the latest and greatest. So thanks for watching this video. What's next in the series? I'll be doing a deeper dive on the security agent, letting you know how that security agent, how the pen testing um, takes place, how it analyzes your code for insecure coding approaches. We'll talk about that. And if you have any feedback, please use the comments. If you have tested this out, let us know what your thoughts are. Did it identify root causes for you? If you had any questions about getting it working, while I have a small number of viewers, I have more time to answer questions. So please don't hesitate to reach out via the comment section. And thanks again for watching the video, and I'll see you.